Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 90 feet wide. 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the princes, prefects, governors, advisors, councillors, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. A herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes and other instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So, at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshipped the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship." Let's retry. Bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They have defied your majesty by refusing to serve your gods or to worship the gold statue you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I've set up? I will give you one more chance. If you bow down and worship the statue I've made, when you hear the sound of the musical instruments, all will be well. But if you refuse, you will be thrown into the blazing furnace. What God will be able to rescue you from my power then?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, your majesty can be sure that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully clothed. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames leapt out and killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell down into the roaring flames. But suddenly, as he was watching, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes," they said, "we did indeed, your majesty." "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire. They aren't even hurt by the flames, and the 4th looks like a divine being." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here!" So Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the princes, prefects, governors and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be crushed into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon.
Thanks, Mary. It's a great story, isn't it? And if you're anywhere near my age, you might remember the film that Willie Rushton did. Do you remember that? You're all looking blank at me. I think it was called A Whole Time in the Town Tonight or something. But anyway, I remember that from my Sunday school days. This is a story that we often engage with in Sunday school, isn't it? But I want us to engage with it as adults today. Well, last December, we were enjoying celebrating our daughter's 30th birthday at Centre Parks in Woburn, which happens to be about 10 minutes away from our house, but we didn't know that when we booked it. But anyway, it was very handy actually, but it was a beautiful snowy weekend. Do you remember that week before Christmas when it was really snowy and icy? And it was incredibly Christmassy in Centre Parks, and it was lovely to be with family and celebrate our daughter's birthday with her and her husband and our grandson, who was about 6 months old at that point, and our other daughter and her husband. So, as you tend to do at Centre Parks, especially if you've got a little one, we were in the tropical centre with all the snow and the ice around. We'd got rid of all our heavy coats and boots and everything, and we were basking in the tropical paradise that is Centre Parks. And there we were in the pool at Centre Parks, enjoying the wave machine, putting Enzo into every kind of inflatable we could find. It was great fun. We were warm, we were enjoying ourselves, we were relaxed. It was snowy outside, but we were toasty. All was well, until suddenly a very loud alarm sounded. So we all got out of the water and we stood there for what must have been about at least 15 or 20 minutes. And the tropical paradise is not quite so warm when you've stood outside still for about 20 minutes. We all had to stand on the side. There were a lot of people in the tropical paradise that particular Saturday morning. And there was no information at all. It was obvious that there was some kind of crisis happening, but nobody seemed to be running. There was obviously nobody in trouble in the water. There was no paramedics coming, just this alarm kept ringing. And after about half an hour, the staff decided that we were all looking pretty cold, So they came round with some rather skimpy space blankets, you know, the type of thing that make you feel like an oven-ready turkey. So we put some of those around us, and we tried to keep the baby warm, but that really wasn't working very well. So a nice lifeguard gave us his fleece, and we were able to wrap Enzo up in this fleece. And we thought, well, this is a bit of a disaster, you know. We all stood here, so after about half an hour, we thought, you know, this isn't a lot of fun. We are actually quite cold now. But then it got worse, because then the message came through, we need you to evacuate. So we thought, well, obviously they're going to evacuate us through the building, but no, we are being evacuated out of the building into the snow and ice, and taking the long walk round to the soft play centre. They said it's only about 5 minutes walk. And so we thought, well, obviously they're going to provide us with flip-flops or something. No, nothing at all. So we all make this long march out into the snow, and literally ice, with nothing on our feet, all in our Speedos, and a little, you know, foil blanket. And it was bizarre, and a little bit unpleasant, if I'm honest. Because 5 minutes walk doesn't sound very much, but when you're walking on ice with nothing on your feet, that's really cold. And it was amazing how people reacted. So people watched us walk. It was like, you know, being on one of the Chinese long marches or something. You know, they were watching us walk, and very few people offered us a coat or anything. It was very strange. Someone did offer us something for the baby, but we were okay there. So it did feel like a bit of a crisis. Anyway, we were walked around. We finally got into the warm again, into a soft play centre, where we then spent the next hour and a half sat in our foil blankets. They did bring us a cup of tea, but as you can imagine, you're pretty cold and fed up of being wet by then. It did feel a little bit like a crisis, I must say. And it was obviously a crisis for them. They never told us what the problem was, but it was a bit of a crisis, and it was very interesting to watch how people reacted. What we did is we sort of huddled together to make sure the baby was warm, and thought, well, we'll make it the best of it. They're bringing us a cup of tea, it's fine. Some people, of course, get really angry, don't they? They get really bolshy. They want to know why they can't get to their locker and get their things. Other people obviously decide to make the best of it, and that was the most fascinating thing to observe. Because in that hour and a half that we were in that soft play centre, some people had fashioned whole outfits out of the foil blankets. It was brilliant. There were shoes, there were dresses, there were hats. It was fantastic. Honestly, we all looked, I mean, we didn't fashion outfits, but it felt like we were bit parts in a very cheap sci-fi drama. All ended well. It was probably more of a crisis for the staff than it was for us. As far as we knew, no one was hurt. But it was a bit of a crisis. And the story we have just heard Mary read is a crisis, isn't it? It's a story of crisis. Nebuchadnezzar seems to be having some kind of midlife crisis, which he is compensating for by building a massive gold statue. Now, I know what Freud would say, but we can only imagine, can't we, what he was compensating for. For the nation, this creates a crisis. Can you imagine this disruption of everyday life? Every time you hear this music, you've got to stop, you've got to completely stop what you're doing, bow down to a golden statue. You're on the way to the shops, oh no, not again. You're about to have dinner, oh, here we go again. You've just got in the bath, oh, for heaven's sake. Imagine what effect this kind of daily disruption would have had on the GDP of Babylon. It is madness, isn't it? It is a crisis. And for the king's astrologers, this represents a crisis too. This capricious and unpredictable king is supposed to be guided by them, of course, but here he is setting up his own deities to compensate for who knows what. And for them, they react to the crisis by throwing their Jewish colleagues under the bus, don't they? And so for Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they are faced with a truly existential crisis. The fire of testing for them is not a metaphor, it is an all-too raging inferno. Here they are in exile in a foreign land. They flourish despite being mistrusted by their indigenous counterparts, and they have remained faithful to their God despite the absence of fellowship and worship space. They find themselves in a very difficult and dangerous place. Their backs are literally against the wall, a religious and personal crisis. So how do they react? Well, first of all, I think it's interesting to note that they don't defend themselves. Verse 16 says this: Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. That is cool, isn't it? I find it absolutely fascinating that these three young men, in fear of their lives, see no need to defend themselves. They are calm in the face of persecution and completely secure of their status. The king may have promoted them to comfortable and gratifying positions, but the only king they answer to is God, and that gives them the freedom to not need to defend themselves. The freedom to be themselves and to be unaffected by the attempts of the king to talk them into obeying him. And here they stand in front of all the king's officials and presumably this band of musicians and face the man who has given them comfortable and high-profile jobs, and they calmly say no. Not defending themselves, just no. How on earth can they be so calm and sure? Well, perhaps because another way that they react is that they have complete faith in God to save them. Verse 17 says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. These three young men have complete faith that whatever the crisis they face, their God has the power to save them. This isn't a pie-in-the-sky sort of faith. This is the fireproof sort of faith. It is a faith that can look into the mouth of the furnace of crisis and say, the God we serve is able to deliver us. And what strikes me as even more incredible about the faith of these men is that they weren't old men. With years of temple teaching and worship to sustain them, they were young men. Young men kidnapped from their home and spiritual formation and placed in a foreign land. And in spite of their lack of age and experience, they had grown in their faith to the point where they could stand in sight of a terrible death and say, the God we serve is able to deliver us. This is mature faith, and it has grown in the most barren of circumstances in young men who could, let's face it, have been having the time of their lives, couldn't they? They've been given power, they've been given money, they've been given responsibility, they're in a foreign land, there's no parent watching them to see that they're keeping the rules, no pressure from grandparents down at the synagogue. This is just them. They could have been having the time of Riley, but what do? They are being prophetic giants at an age where they may not even have been barely listened to back home. But even more amazing is the fact that this faith is not a brash assumption that God will indeed save them. Because the third thing that they react with is that they do not need God to act for their faith to be exonerated. Verse 18, perhaps the most remarkable verse of the whole story, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Even if he does not. These boys refuse to bow down, even if God, in his infinite wisdom, chooses not on that particular day to save them. Their faith isn't based on everything being okay, or God turning up when they want him. It is based on God being God. For them, that would not depend on their own personal outcome, as if he had something to prove to them personally. For these three young men, God was God whether he stepped in or not. And this isn't a blind obedience. This is the kind of faith that grows out of a relationship with a God who is faithful in the small and the large things of life. It is the kind of faith that must have grown as they came to terms with their exile and all the loss which that must have resulted in. They'd lost their home, their families, their place of worship and their community of faith. It is the kind of faith that must have grown as they were given jobs they felt unprepared for and yet received the wisdom they needed. It is the kind of faith that must have grown as they refused to eat the meat offered them in the king's training facility and yet grew stronger than their contemporaries eating only vegetables. It is the kind of faith that must have grown as they faced certain death in the midst of Nebuchadnezzar's last midlife crisis and prayed to God for the interpretation of his dream. These boys had learned through a series of crises that God was faithful and that they were part of his plan. They didn't need him to act to prove that. They just needed to trust. And so what were the results of this outstanding faith? Well, I think the first thing we need to notice is that God doesn't actually prevent them from suffering in the fire, does he? It might have been nice if God had somehow prevented Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego from being put anywhere near that fiery furnace, but that isn't what happened. They went through what must have been a terrifying ordeal, being tied up and thrown in. Even being near the furnace killed the soldiers throwing them in, so we can only imagine the fear they experienced. It seems that completely sparing them the crisis wasn't God's plan. But God gets in the fire with them. Even though the young men go through this ordeal, what we and Nebuchadnezzar realise is that they don't go through it alone. God has been with them all the way, invisibly. And yet now, at the most awful moment of testing, he is more present than ever and visible to them and the paranoid king. And in the midst of the furnace of testing, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are walking with God. Now, I'm sure this must have been a surreal and frightening experience, but there is God in the midst of the heat with them. This godly presence in suffering is in fact the turning point for Nebuchadnezzar, and he calls them out of the furnace. Which leads to the third result of this faith, that God is glorified. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego emerge from the flames without even a scorch or smelling of smoke, we are told, and the egocentric king has to acknowledge that their God is sovereign over all. The crisis remained, but God was triumphant by being present in the middle of it. So how do we apply this story to our situation? Well, I wonder how you react to a crisis. If you'd been with our family in the middle of Centre Parks, would you have been one of those people making a fuss? Would you, like us, have just huddled under your collective foil blankets and been grateful for the tea? Or would you have been one of those entrepreneurs making outfits out of the foil? Well, as a denomination, friends, we are facing very real crisis. I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that numbers in church, in most churches, are dropping. This is happening in all denominations, and we are experiencing some of that too. we are also facing a crisis in terms of a lack of ministers. For our Baptist family to keep the amount of ministers that we have and to keep serving all the churches that we have to train 66 new ministers a year. So in all four of our colleges, we have to train 66 a year just to keep the number the same. Anybody know how many we sent into training last year? 26. 26. For the first time in our history, the graph showing churches that need ministers and ministers looking for churches has crossed. And if you're one of those churches without a minister at the moment, you'll know that because you'll have had one of us coming around to tell you about it and explaining that that's why it's going to take longer, possibly, for you to call a minister this time. This is a crisis. It's a crisis for all of us, whether we are in pastoral vacancy or not. And then, of course, there is the elephant in the room, the crisis we are facing over our consultation regarding the ministerial recognition rules on marriage. How do we respond to changing culture, to the need to value Scripture, and the desire to react well to issues of justice? We are in the midst of an existential crisis about who we are and how do we live with difference. But as a denomination, we also have a financial crisis. Giving is down, and yet what we are trying to do in our churches in meeting the needs of those around us is increasing all the time. And if that wasn't enough, we are all facing a mental health crisis that seems to have engulfed our nation. I'm sure it was there before COVID, but COVID has really revealed the state of our nation, hasn't it? The viral pandemic has uncovered just how deadly the pandemic of loneliness and anxiety affects so many. It has laid bare the disparities of the rich and the poor and the very physical effects of that injustice. Friends, we are in crisis. And I realise this isn't the most encouraging news for you to help you digest your bacon sandwich. And you may well be thinking, I wish I hadn't turned out on a Saturday for this sort of thing. And yet I think even in the midst of crisis, we have a message of hope and faith to share, and we see it in the story that we have just read. Firstly, we have to trust God to be with us in the crisis, don't we? It may seem obvious to point out, but it was God's presence in the crisis of the furnace that turned the course of events. And that same God is with us in each crisis we face, whether personal or our collective crisis together. He is not unaware of our shrinking congregations or our lack of ministers or our heartache over the consultation. He is in these moments of testing with us. He is there walking with us through it. And if we can trust God to be with us, then maybe we can trust him to help us to respond, like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Maybe we can have the faith not to be defensive, but to stand calmly in the face of struggle. Perhaps we can have the faith to say to the world and each other that God does have the power to save. And even if we don't see his action in every situation we would like, we will still trust him to do what is right and good. We can trust him to be with us in the pastoral vacancy, in disagreement about the MINREC rules, in a sense of fear about dwindling numbers. He walked with us in that fire as surely as he walked with those three courageous young men. And of course we would rather we weren't facing trials and testing at all. That maybe like those young men in Babylon, we can see and trust that God might make this crisis part of his glorious plan. Has it ever occurred to us, I wonder, that this testing period in our denomination's history might actually be part of his glorious plan for us? Uncomfortable as many of these issues are, perhaps we will all learn more about our sovereign God through the sense of crisis they provide. And maybe there are things we can learn about ourselves in the process. Some of the things we are facing are within our own scope to address. The lack of ministers in the Baptist family is a problem we're going to be facing for quite some time. But it is also a wake-up call to think back to our Baptist roots in the way that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego remembered their worshipping roots. Baptist ministers have always come from the local church. They have never arrived in from outside. They have always been homegrown. That's what we do as Baptists. It is part of our Baptist DNA to be on the lookout for those who God is calling into wider ministry. Now that might be fully accredited ministry, or it might be recognised local ministry, but we need to be on the lookout for who God may be calling from amongst us and encouraging them to explore that call. Now, I am thrilled that I've had 2 conversations today already with 2 people who are feeling that call. Praise God. But we need to give these people opportunities. We need to allow them to make mistakes. We need to allow them to move into spaces where they can test that call. We need to be putting them on our diaconates. We need to be asking them to lead services. We need to be offering them to other churches to practice their preaching skills. And we need to be speaking to our regional ministers about those people. So I am relying on you to be looking out for those people who may be called in ministry among you. The Learning Collective, which is our new mode of training for lay leaders and for locally recognised ministers, is about to launch in September, and we are so excited about it. You're going to hear more about it later, but don't go without knowing what it's about today. The mental health crisis is something we are all facing in one way or another, but maybe this is one of those moments which becomes a God with us moment, where God becomes visible like his presence in the furnace. We may feel ill-equipped to help people with their anxiety and loneliness, but there are ways that we can learn to reach out. Renew Wellbeing is an expression of mission and compassion that any church can do, however small. You're going to find out from Ruth later on just how easy it is to do and how much help she and her organisation can give you. So talk to her, talk to Rachel, talk to Sarah, find out about their experiences today. Find out how a Renew Wellbeing space might open up your church to people you would have never reached before. And by the way, be prepared for it to change your church. Our finances may always be a challenge, but we must make sure that we are not squandering any of the resources God has given us. We may not have many young people in our churches, but we need to be trusting and consciously developing the ones we have got. If you have young people in your church, why not think about sending them on the Equip course? There's details about that coming too. This is a course that enables them to develop into leaders. If you've only got a few young people in your church, they're the ones that need to be telling you how to get some more in. You need to be asking them to be involved. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were young men who God used. I wonder who we might be overlooking because they are young. So finally, friends, we are facing a crisis, but the same God that walked with those young men in the fiery furnace walks with us now. He can turn all of these challenges into his opportunities if we will but trust him. He hasn't changed, but maybe our faith in his abilities has along the way. Perhaps as a movement of Baptist churches, we need to be reminded that this same God has not left us. His saving message of love is just as powerful and relevant as it's ever been. And we may be struggling in a time of crisis, but we have a God who uses those same moments of crisis to make himself known. So let's trust him and look for ways in which we can face the crisis, looking to his abundance rather than our own lack of resources. Psalm 31 and verse 23 says this: "Love the Lord, all his faithful people. The Lord preserves those who are true to him, but the proud he pays back in full. Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord."